Good afternoon, fellow Blue Devils. Welcome to this Alumni Forever Learning Institute, an interdisciplinary educational program organized in a set of thematic courses. My name is Abdullah Antepli. I'm a professor of the practice at Sanford School of Public Policy. Thank you for joining our program. Discussing our boundaries, this program is part of our theme, Discourse for Our Democracy, sponsored by Polis, Center for Politics, with the Sanford School of Public Policy. We will have three paired conversations between faculty and alumni on three distinct topics of importance as we enter the midterm elections in the US on November 8th within a couple of weeks. Joining us, we are so lucky to have Darrell Miller, Melvin G. Shimm Professor of Law, and the proud member of Class of 98, James Burnett, who will discuss Second Amendment rights and the gun control. And following them, my dear good friend, Professor Ken Rogerson, Professor of Public Policy at Sanford, and the proud member of Class of 88, Lee Tiedrich, who will be discussing the interplay of technology and media in our democracy. And last but not least, Kate Evans, Clinical Professor of Law, and the proud member of Class of 2013, Ashley Lessiter, who will be discussing immigrant rights and the law enforcement. Without no further ado, I would like to invite the first Professor Miller and James to discuss on the Second Amendment rights and the gun control. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having us. I'm really delighted to be part of this discussion with all you out there, alumni. Again, I'm Darrell Miller. I'm the Melvin G. Shimm Professor of Law at Duke Law School. I don't have the blessings of having been a graduate of Duke University, but I do love my colleagues and am having a great time as a Duke professor. And I'm really happy to start this conversation with James, who is the editor of The Trace, on this really pertinent and sort of evergreen issue about the Second Amendment, gun rights, and gun regulation. So with no further ado, James, you want to start the conversation?
Yeah, thank you, Darrell. And it's great to be here. I appreciate my thanks to the Forever Learning Institute for this opportunity. You look at the facts when it comes to gun violence, as it's often referred to in America. Latest numbers showed 133 people killed per day. That's inclusive of both homicides and suicides. That rate of gun violence is unique among developed nations. So is our rate of firearm ownership and sort of total guns in circulation. But when we get into so what do we do about that? The shorthand for that is often the gun debate, right? So we've been engaged in this gun debate. Darrell, I think the first thing that, it's important to establish, and that debate, I should say, is really a debate about what does the Second Amendment mean? What does it allow or not permit when it comes to regulation? Darrell, your scholarship touches on this. So tell us sort of, what does the Second Amendment actually say when it comes to the boundaries, our theme today, for gun rights and regulation in the United States?
Sure. Happy to sort of field that question. So I guess some ground clearing points. It's not a very long amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, right? So that's what it says. And really, for most of its history, as a legal matter, as a matter of federal law, it didn't actually have a whole lot of content aside from a militia. So that all changed in 2008 with a case called District of Columbia versus Heller, in which the court held for the first time that you had a federal constitutional right to keep and bear arms for personal purposes like self-defense. And I want to emphasize the practicalities, because I approach this as a lawyer. So before 2008, if you were a felon in possession of a gun, and you were caught with a gun, you really had no Second Amendment claim at all, right? You could go into court, you could make an argument, but it was summarily dismissed because there was just no legal content for you. After 2008, it was on the wall that you might be able to say, well, I'm a nonviolent felon, or my felony conviction is superannuated, or whatever. So the thing to remember is that as far as a legally enforceable right at the federal level and at state level, it's actually fairly new. The other thing that I think in terms of ground clearing is important to realize is there's two conversations that are going on. I approach the Second Amendment as a lawyer and a legal scholar, so I'm really interested in the legal content of it. But there's also the political uses of the Second Amendment that aren't necessarily legal. So let me give you a concrete example of that. Even after the Supreme Court's recent decision, the decision called New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, which was just handed down in June. Even after that, the court says that, for example, licensing shall issue licensing where there is limited discretion to issue a license. It's still okay, still constitutional as a legal matter. That doesn't prevent people and activists, gun rights activists, from saying permitless carry, that is the right to carry a gun without a permit, without a license at all, is what the Constitution requires. That's not a legal claim, that's a political claim. It's a political claim on what the Second Amendment means. And in fact, it's encoded in permitless carry, is sometimes called constitutional carry. So, that's the use of the Constitution, but not in a legal sense. It's used in a political sense. Why? Because the Supreme Court of the United States says you could have a licensing rule, but some people say, no, you can't. And that's the separation between law and politics with regard to the Second Amendment. The one thing that I think people sort of misunderstand, and I and my colleague Joseph Blocher have tried to sort of outline, is there's actually a lot of history of regulation of firearms in history of the United States and in the predecessor to the Second Amendment, which is in England. It's really so saying something like, don't you believe in the Second Amendment, or that violates the Second Amendment, is subject to a set of legal arguments, but it's not necessarily self-evident any one of those things. There are some people, for example, that would think that prohibiting minor children from having guns is a violation of the Second Amendment. So the more important questions, I think, about the Second Amendment are what do you think the balance of rights and regulation is, and not the Second Amendment as a kind of conversation closer where somebody says, this is what I think a good regulation would be, and somebody says, don't you believe in the Second Amendment? And that's supposed to end all conversation on the topic. I'm sorry. So, having talked about this sort of separation between politics and the political uses and the legal uses of the Second Amendment, I'm kind of interested in your perspective as a journalist, as somebody who's essentially been studying or interviewing people on Second Amendment and gun rights and regulation issues for a while. How the people that you encounter and that you interview for your stories, how do they tend to sort of understand and sort of interact with the Second Amendment?
I think you begin with the sort of broad middle. It might be a kind of silent majority on this particular issue of gun owners who support a number of restrictions on gun purchasing and on gun carrying. Things like background checks and expanding those to private transactions. Things like where guns can be carried. Something like what kind of gun can be owned, an assault style rifle, for example. There you get into places where maybe among gun owners, there's sort of less support for those restrictions, but certainly there is a broad base of support. But you come back to the text of the amendment itself, and there's that one phrase, shall not be infringed, which is embraced by a kind of gun rights absolutists who believe that the Constitution allows no restriction on the right, and that the owning firearms is so key to individual liberty, and in that conception, democracy, that to any regulation would be a slippery slope. How that actually manifests in a really interesting way is when the law allows military-style weapons to be owned by civilians, when the law allows those guns to be carried openly in public spaces, you have, as we saw earlier in the pandemic, a group of armed demonstrators in opposition of some of the COVID mitigation measures in the state of Michigan storm the State House using, no one was shot, but the gun becomes a very potent political tool to exert your sort of policy preferences over those actually chosen by lawmakers. You had armed protests outside of public health officials' homes around the country. The idea that the gun is a measure of intimidation that can influence policy outcomes outside of what I think most people would understand as the democratic process. And that, I think, in the wake of January 6th, certainly, and some of the rhetoric around elections right now, I think that's deeply concerning. And Darrell, I've heard you talk a little bit about how when we measure the harms or the effects of our current gun laws, when policymakers measure it, that maybe that analysis is missing these ways in which guns can affect voting, public spaces, and a whole bunch of things that maybe we obviously take for granted as bedrocks of our democracy. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So as my, as my colleague sort of has mentioned, this is his turn of phrase, like the gun debate tends to be about, quote, bodies and bullets. So the trade-offs that are used, if in fact trade-offs matter, right? You care about trade-offs, are usually things like defensive gun use, by law-abiding citizens versus the harms caused by criminal use of guns, for violence. But that's not necessarily capturing everything that's relevant in the calculus for reasons that you mentioned, right? So the person that stops going to the local farmers market because of persons are trying to show up there with a firearm, or the person that stops going to the polling place because they have a fear of having to navigate a gauntlet of armed citizens, or the person that stops participating in peaceful public protests to register their support or displeasure on any given issue. Those are really hard to count. You can count people that show up in hospital beds, or in morgues with gunshot wounds. You can't really count, or we don't have a way of quite assessing all the people that stop doing that, or the kids that have learning difficulties because of violence in schools. So one of the things that's I think lost in the discussion and needs to really be sort of pursued is getting a full 360-degree understanding of truly all the costs and benefits of guns in our society, and making sure that we are measuring everything that needs to be measured, as opposed to a very small slice of some of these issues. And to your point, I totally think that it is sort of deleterious to our democracy. If you have elected representatives who either stop running for re-election or are making decisions about the important trade-offs that any public policy demands under the shadow of armed persons trying to intimidate them. That seems really anathema to basic democratic norms that we would accept in in the United States, and I think should try to resist the normalization of guns as registering political dissent as opposed to other peaceful mechanisms.
Yeah, and I think we've got about 2 minutes left. I think you have seen some lawmakers at the state level respond to that with, I think, in Washington State, one example comes to mind where new regulations, restrictions have been imposed about the carrying and displaying of guns on Capitol grounds or in government buildings to try to address that intimidation factor. There are things that states and localities can do to actually prevent sort of militias and armed groups from trying to influence public debate in public spaces. Not complete solutions, but some reason for saying that we're not stuck where we are. When you address the actual violence itself, you have this Bruin case that has state and local policymakers unsure of what they can do about where guns are carried. We have limited options for addressing what kinds of guns are owned, both politically. It's hard to get 60 votes for an assault weapons ban in plain terms in the Senate. But we did just have 65 votes, 15 Republicans vote for a package called the Safer Communities Act. And as a closing thought, this is an oversimplification, but what it does through funding mechanisms and other provisions is it provides resources to community-led responses to gun violence. So it's basically empowering the public to be more active in public safety and aligns they're very important questions in this gun debate, but we've been sort of politically stuck. But I think the big picture is we don't have to be stuck overall. There are things that you can do to address gun violence at the sort of grassroots or community level that have promise. And there's some growing momentum there. So maybe we'll talk a little bit more in the Q&A about what those look like.
This might be a good place to pause. I'm sure in the Q&A there will be more conversations. My wife and I, we are Americans by choice. We wanted to be citizens of this wonderful country. But our Second Amendment gun control and gun violence is one of the most difficult aspects of American society. It's even more difficult to explain this to our relatives in Europe and the Middle East. I don't know if anybody tried to explain this to non-Americans. It's a whole different conversation. Thank you, James and Darrell. Up next, we have my dear friend, Professor Ken Rogerson and Lee Tiedrich, who will be discussing the interplay of technology and media in our democracy, which is another very current and buzzing topic. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Abdullah. Grateful to be here today, and grateful to share the screen with Lee, who is an incredible expert in these issues. I'm going to start us off here. You'll see my back screen is the DeWitt Wallace Center. Let me see if I can move a little bit, for Media and Democracy. And this is one of the centers at the Sanford School of Public Policy. Duke does not have a journalism school or a media studies department per se. There's visual media studies that looks at more at film and photography, but for media and democracy, we have a center, and we are very much interested in news and media and what that means for our democracy. I'm an affiliated faculty member. I am the head of our certificate program in journalism and media studies here on campus. And to follow up, we've just heard a little bit about the Second Amendment, and now we are going to pivot backwards to the First Amendment. One of the things that I always talk to my students about that they seem to know but don't seem to recognize is the United States was the first country in the world to grapple with media. Now, media had existed way before the U.S. existed, and there were a lot of information channels and ways for people to communicate. Most of it was controlled by the ruling power, governments, monarchies, and things like that. So the fact that the founders grappled with this is a really important concept to deal with. And more importantly, I'm not going to do this quiz, but there are 5 freedoms in the First Amendment, and only 2% of the U.S. population can name all 5. But we're going to do 2 of the most well-known ones, which are the freedom of the press and freedom of speech. And note that they are 2 different things. freedom of speech is different than media freedom or news or journalism freedom, but they are connected and they overlap a lot in the things that in the issues that arise because of them. So I want to point that out. And now today there are many other countries in the world that have a similar type of stated freedom in their legal system. A lot of democracies, some that might be less democratic, actually have this language. So I always like to point out to my students that it's something that we exported that is not a terrible thing in the world. I'll be right up front to say I'm a First Amendment advocate, and I do believe in freedom of speech and freedom of the press, but I understand that there must be some nuances and some boundaries, and that's certainly where we are in this world right now. But I also like to point out to students that we exported some bad things too, and one of those things is something called yellow journalism or sensational journalism. We are pretty good at that in this country because the media is not an arm of the government. And because of that, we tend to allow some freedoms there that we might shake our heads. We're pretty good at voyeuristic journalism. There's an old journalistic adage, well, we give the people what they want. Sometimes we don't want great things. So that said, as we kind of move forward in democracy, one of the things that I'm sure is on all of your minds right now is, okay, I think that media is hurting our democracy more than helping it. Initially, certainly having that free press and free speech was meant to further democracy and help democracy. It was meant to provide for an informed citizenry, is another phrase that we see a lot in my field. And maybe that's true out there. And there are lots of arguments one way or the other. But we are moving to a stage right now where there's a lot of discussion about what to do with some of the problems that media brings with it. An early problem was libel. That was taken care of through some free speech court cases, but that there's a pretty high level of you have to show absence of malice. You have to show there's a high level that you have to show in order to actually prove libel. But now we're in an area where we have to decide what to do with the speech that we are seeing. One of the things I'm sure that has crossed your mind is, well, what about fake news? And I tell you, we talk about this a lot with students and wondering about okay, what do we do about this? Some of it is media literacy, but we can't put all the burden on just the receivers of media and receivers of messages. And so we have to talk about what that misinformation and disinformation, which is unconscious and conscious sharing of false information. Note that it happens unconsciously sometimes. Then we think that we believe something, or we think we have enough support or information. We have enough evidence that says, well, this could be true. But I spend a lot of time with students trying to grapple with, well, how do you know what's true? There's a big fact-checking movement. I'd like to call out the Reporters Lab and at the DeWitt Wallace Center, and we are one of the centers for studying fact-checking and whether it works and how it can work better in the world right now. And we're the home to a really great network of global fact-checkers. So obviously this comes out. So what do you do with social media? I don't know how many of you use social media, and if so, what is your social media of choice? Or do you use multiple things? Social media is a problem. If you follow the news, you'll see some very interesting cases that would be before the Supreme Court this year that have to do with social media and how liable they are for the content there. So Lee, I'd like to throw that question out to you. Like what's going on there? We like social media. We have a lot of fun there, but it also can make us very, very angry. What's going on?
Yeah, so thanks, Ken, and it's a pleasure to be here. And in addition to being a proud Duke alum, as Abdullah said, I'm also now a Duke faculty member, having come back here after having been away for quite some time. And I teach in the law school, and I also teach in science and society, ethical tech. And I think to kind of pick up where Ken left off, what we're seeing with social media, and we've seen with a lot of emerging technologies, that we really are at this inflection point where the technology has moved a lot faster than the law. And I think one of the grand challenges, as I tell my students, is, how do we come up with frameworks, legal frameworks, policy frameworks, standards, self-regulation, so society can capitalize on the benefits of these technologies? Because like Ken said, they're grounded in the First Amendment and we value our freedom of speech, but also mitigate the risks. Because as he also pointed out, there's a lot of potential risks with social media too, with the disinformation campaigns and certainly with the elections. And, the law is trying to catch up. And I'll just kind of highlight a couple of developments on the legal front to keep an eye on. One of the things that Congress did back in the 1990s, before we really had social media, was they passed the Communications Decency Act. And that gives platforms, social media platforms, it insulates them from liability for third-party content that's hosted on the site. So, on the one hand, giving the platforms that protection from liability fosters that robust marketplace of ideas. On the other hand, it does kind of open the door for the misinformation, disinformation. And one of the things that Congress has been considering is whether that, it's called the Communications Decency Act or Section 230, whether that ought to be amended to hold platforms more accountable. And picking up on what Ken said, while other jurisdictions have similar First Amendment type protections, one of the things that we're seeing is that it doesn't quite go as far as our First Amendment in other jurisdictions. So we're starting to see efforts of regulators in other jurisdictions to regulate that. Another phenomena that's come up is, platforms have been trying to take it upon themselves. So I put this in the framework of self-regulation on how do we moderate the content. And Ken will talk about this in a second, but like a lot of the platforms have adopted their own content moderation policies as a form of self-regulation. And what we've seen recently is a couple of the states, in particular Texas and Florida, have said, we don't like the way that the platforms are conducting content moderation. And they have passed state statutes that limit the ability of the platforms to moderate content. And in addition, impose transparency obligations on the platforms to disclose certain information about how they're implementing content moderation. Not surprisingly, these statutes, both in Texas and Florida, have been challenged in the courts. And we, as of last week, now have a split among the circuits. We have one circuit saying that this concept of content moderation it violates First Amendment, and they would enjoin the statute in Florida. The Fifth Circuit looked at the Texas statute and basically upheld the statute. So, as Ken said, more likely than not, this will end up before the Supreme Court. And I think, the challenge in terms of society is, there's a lot of good benefits of the technology. How do we encourage them, but mitigate the risk? And Ken, I'll flip it back to you. I know you've done a lot of work on content moderation policies and looking what the platform's done. In your views, has that been successful?
Oh, that's such a great and loaded question, Lee. When we talk about this with my students, I've done some exercises with them where we'll throw out, here are some examples of content moderation activity, and then I'll let them grapple with like should it be taken down or should it not be taken down? I think before I go into a couple of examples, one of the basic principles that I think we're struggling with here is that we have policymakers who don't completely understand the technology itself. We've seen that over the past few years as heads of social media companies have testified before Congress. And I know that at least technology policy people, our jaws drop at some of the questions. And it's not the actual members of Congress. Sometimes it's their staff too, because their staff are writing the questions, that they're just not understanding the technical aspects and the nuances, the ethical implications of some of the things that are happening. And so what we see in proposals are what we would, the vision that I try to give my students is putting a Band-Aid on a spurting jugular vein. Like it's a little bit, but it's not like, it's really problematic to see what some of the potential solutions are. So what's happened basically is, so there's Section 230, which allows the freedom. There are a few small laws out there. There's one on online gambling, for example. There's a small online gambling law that was passed that actually regulates banks and not the actual gambling industry. But there's very little regulation on speech on the internet. So what we have are big companies who don't want to be regulated. We have government who is, in its rhetoric, is saying there needs to be some regulation there. And then you have some attempts by these companies to do something, and the government says, okay, that's probably enough. So one of the examples is the Facebook Oversight Board, which is a third-party group that they've convened to take on some of the more challenging things that happen at Facebook. So Facebook will take down some pages. Someone will petition and say, I don't think you should have taken down my page. It can go to the oversight board. There are tens, hundreds of thousands of people who petition that. The board is looking at maybe 20 cases a year. It doesn't even begin to meet the need of people there. So there is some self-regulation. There are attempts to do that. There are policies that are in place, but it can be really challenging. Lee, we just have a minute or two left. If you want to add anything more to that or any context to that on the regulatory side, that would be great.
Yeah, no, I mean, I fully agree. I mean, having practiced law for 30 years, that we do have a gap between what the technical knowledge and the policymaker knowledge. And one of the things that I'm working on at Duke in collaboration with the Sanford School, with the Pratt School, is really trying to come up with ways to kind of bridge that gap. So we're all talking about the same language and trying to come up with understandings that work. I mean, one of my principles that I'm passionate about is that whatever technical solutions the policymakers devise, whether it's around transparency, content moderation, it needs to be grounded in science and it needs to work. And I think that is a big challenge. And we're certainly hoping at Duke that we can do our part to advance that conversation. And it takes a village across Duke, but we're committed to doing it.
Thank you very much, Lee and Ken. Fascinating conversation. And if you're not following the DeWitt Wallace Media Center, you are missing so much. I believe Joe has shared the website. Maybe it could be shared again. Some of their activities, the faculty involved, the public intellectual work that the center does. It's quite fascinating and worth following. Thank you very much. And up next, we have Kate Evans and Ashley Lasseter, who will be talking about immigrant rights and the law enforcement. Ashley and Kate, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's really a delight to be here and see so many people tuning in for these discussions and get to hear from my colleagues across the university on very pressing issues and get a little bit more analysis, a little bit deeper into the things we read in the headlines. We, I think, are no exception, although we're a little different as a pair. I started Duke Law's Immigrant Rights Clinic in 2020. Most of what we do is defending immigrants against deportation in the immigration courts and in that system as a whole. I'm delighted to meet Ashley Lasseter outside of the courtroom. We are generally on opposite sides of the cases, litigating against each other. And so it's actually, not personally, but in terms of our offices and our employers. And so it's really nice to be in a conversation outside the courtroom and get a chance to talk in a non-adversarial setting about the big sort of world of immigration policy, not just the particular cases in front of us on a given day. I think Ashley's going to kick us off in starting this conversation, and we'll go from there.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I want to start by saying how grateful I am to be part of this opportunity as well. I think this is an amazing opportunity for everyone to learn about some things that have been in the news, but there's a lack of understanding about some of the nuances that are going on. So if you can start by telling us what is the true landscape of immigration in today, talking about the number of immigrants, the reasons why people immigrate to the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love starting with this because I think it's really important to understand sort of the full scope of how immigration impacts the United States in so many different places and ways. There are about 45 million immigrants in the United States, meaning people who were born outside of the territory of the United States. That's a little over 13%, going on 14% of the population in the United States. North Carolina, just as an aside, is a little lower. It's about 8.5% of the population in North Carolina. But I think it's also important to talk about the proportion of U.S. citizens who have a spouse or a parent who is foreign born, and therefore is intimately affected by immigration law and immigration policy. And that group approaches nearly a quarter of the U.S. population. So what we do in the field of immigration, impacts large numbers of people, and a large portion of those families who are living in the United States. Mexico continues to be the country that is the nationality or country of origin for the largest proportion of immigrants in the United States, with about 24%. With China, India, the Philippines following. Asian immigration now accounts for about 37% of new arrivals each year. It's more actually than Hispanic immigration. So I think it's always important to sort of check what our assumptions are about who is sort of dominating the immigration flows to the United States. It's actually Asian immigrants now that are in the lead. In terms of the reason that people immigrate to the United States, largely and sort of, in terms of our policy, it's first and foremost family unity. So we grant permanent lawful status to anywhere from about 350,000 to 500,000 people every year based on their family connections in the United States, those family relationships. People also come here for employment, both permanent and temporary employment. And so we have as many as 200,000 people being granted permanent status based on their employer relationships. And then that figure really explodes when you're talking about temporary employment, when people are coming here for a job and then returning to their home country. That's closer to 6 million people. I think we hear in the news a lot about humanitarian protection and refugees and asylees. In the last couple of years, based on border policies, COVID, the capacity to actually resettle people, we've had a relatively low number of refugees resettled. We're talking about 11,000 in 2021. That may go up a little bit this year. We normally resettle something like 70 to 90,000 people a year. And historically, we have been the country that receives the most refugees and resettles the most refugees. It's not true presently, but may become so again. And there's about 120,000 asylum applications that are filed every year. And so that's a much smaller sort of number and proportion than those other family and employment numbers we were talking about. And then, of course, people, especially in the university, come to research and study. And so we have lots of temporary folks that are coming here, as scholars and as students, and then, may become one of the folks that is here for family or employment or returns home. So that's sort of the overall picture. We are reducing our numbers of unauthorized immigrants. Again, sort of thinking about what's in the news, that we hit the peak of that in about 2007, and now we're down to about 10 million people who are unauthorized. The vast majority of those, about 2/3, have been in the United States for 10 years or more. So this is a population that has, sort of extended roots in the United States generally, not recent arrivals. And most recently, the majority of people who end up in unauthorized status have come here with a visa and are overstaying. And so they no longer have lawful status, so they came in with it. So again, sort of in contrast to, folks coming in on the southern border, that's more like 1/3 of the people that are ending up in the United States without authorized status. So lots of statistics, but I think sort of understanding on a global scale just how far the reach is for immigration and how diverse it is, both in terms of where people are coming from and why people are coming here. Now, turning to, the headlines, we hear a lot about border policy. Certainly, this is, a year in which we've seen the highest number of encounters and arrests on the southern border, not necessarily all entering, but but high flows coming in to the United States. And a lot of discussion around how those migration flows should be managed and could be managed. Ashley, I'd love to hear from you, what you think states and the federal government can do, and how states could work together, both on the border, off the border, and with the federal government.
I believe that states can help enforce immigration laws and deter illegal non-citizens from residing in their states in two major aspects, law enforcement and employment. One of the major driving forces behind illegal immigration is our economy and the ability to earn money. And not all non-citizens are authorized to work in the U.S. That is one of the misconceptions that a lot of people have, that if the person is not here with legal status, that they are not authorized to work in the United States. That's not necessarily true. If a non-citizen has a pending petition with either the United States Citizen and Immigration Services, or while they are pending in removal proceedings, then they may be authorized for employment. For those non-citizens who do not have employment authorization, states can work with employers to create licensing agreements and to prevent employers from hiring non-citizens not authorized to work and preventing them from earning a wage. One of the big things that have come up in more of the southern states along the southern border is preventing them from picking up day laborers who try to circumvent the employment laws by participating in day labor where they only work under the table without an official work agreement. So if states both on the border and within the United States can work with employers to stem some of this illegal employment, then that would discourage new immigrants from trying to seek employment in the United States without authorization. Another way that we can help stem some of the illegal immigration would be to work with local law enforcement to help remove criminal non-citizens from the United States. So to show that we are trying to enforce immigration policies by focusing on criminal aliens and trying to work with local law enforcement to enforce the immigration laws, I think would also be a deterrent for illegal non-citizens. So there are a lot of ways that the states can help just multiply our enforcement ability from the federal government, because as Ms. Evans indicated, there are a lot of illegal non-immigrants and non-citizens in the United States, and we cannot be everywhere at once. So the states can help multiply our law enforcement ability by working with their policies and local law enforcement to help out in that respect. And hopefully strengthening our law enforcement ability would help deter the current migration of non-citizens into this country.
Thank you very much, Ashley and Kate. Three incredibly rich topics for us to discuss, each of which can take hours, but we have only 16 minutes to have a lively Q&A with our panelists. I have two quick requests, or one request and announcement. Please turn on your videos if you are able, so you can have a lively conversation with our great panelists. Also, join me in lifting up and celebrating Jewish Blue Devils on this call and even beyond, as they have just entered the Jewish New Year. We wish them Shana Tova, and they are about to celebrate Yom Kippur, one of the most important days in the Jewish calendar. Many people will be fasting, but before you fast for one day and complain, think of your Muslim friends who do this for about a month. So this could always get worse. Count your blessings, but we wish everyone a meaningful and rewarding Yom Kippur. So the first question from Mark Tenenbaum.
I can see Mark's questions here. I'm going to toss it to Darrell, because I think this is an interesting, there's some tension in this. The question is, in terms of open carry, why should laws exclude state houses, courtrooms, churches, college campuses, school grounds, which those laws do, Why should those locations be exempt from open carry? Why should the public in general be less safe than those in those specific locations?
Right. So this is the question hits upon a really difficult and actually fascinating aspect of this issue. So the Supreme Court of the United States says that you can ban guns in what's known as sensitive places. It just sort of, says there are sensitive places like government buildings and schools that you can ban guns. Now, to a true gun rights stalwart who believes that more guns in more places actually makes everybody better off, the place that you ban guns is where you need them. So it's in some ways like it's circular, right? If you ban guns in a sensitive place, then that's where they're most needed. If you don't buy that as a premise, then I've written a piece on this, and my colleague again has also written some work on this about, sensitive places, or this idea isn't just about safety in the sense of me trying to protect my physical well-being. It's about protecting the body politic. So there's other things that happen in schools or government buildings or polling places that aren't just about protecting human life or human welfare, but more about trying to generate a culture where we opt for peaceful political solutions to disputes rather than threats, or we try to generate First Amendment content, protected speech, or peaceful religious worship, for example. And so my take on this is it's not, I understand the framing, but the framing needs to think a little bit broader about there are reasons why we have these guns banned from places that might have to do with something other than just physical safety.
There's this, a giant carve out, of course, for private property. And there's been an interesting development, has not become law to my knowledge in any states, but we've seen bills in a few states that have tried to compel private property holders to allow guns concealed or openly carried on the grounds that should a violent act happen to the gun owner who is unarmed while on private property, the property owner would be, and I may be sort of contorting the legal theory here, but liable for not allowing that gun owner to be armed and protected in that space. I raise that just to show that this idea of sort of unmitigated gun rights, we're seeing it sort of push into all these sort of strange spaces in ways that I think are pretty difficult for policymakers. That one maybe not so difficult to grapple with, but they are. They're right. Really fascinating questions for policymakers and for judges.
And then we can move on to the next set of questions. But just to sort of emphasize, there's nothing about the Second Amendment that requires this. When people started protesting Starbucks because they were saying you can't take the guns into Starbucks, that's the lawyer in me starts to get a bit rankled, because Starbucks isn't bound by the Second Amendment. It might be bound by other kinds of rules, but the Second Amendment doesn't say anything about private actors in the same way that the First Amendment doesn't do anything for private actors.
Yes. We are going to try something really creative here with the help of Joe. We will try to bundle several of the questions together and ask a two-part question to each pair of the panel. In your area that you presented, what can Duke do more or better that it's not doing right now? Some self-critical reflection on in these areas of immigration law, media, or gun violence or gun control, where this institution can do more. And then these Blue Devil Americans, when they vote within a couple of weeks on November 8th, what do you think in these areas, again, they should know or consider? What are some of the most important things that you would like to highlight that should be part of the conversation as they register their vote? I'll start with Kate and Ashley. What can do more, and about the election?
Sure. I'm going to start with the election question, because I think that's probably both a little bit more pressing, and I think Duke's I'm delighted at all the things that Duke is doing. We do DACA renewals for a bunch of people. We did that through like a drive-through mechanism during COVID. We do that university-wide. And I think there's a lot of really good things that Duke is doing to support and investigate immigration, both history, law, policy. So, sorry for the lack of critical lens on that one. But at least with regard to the elections and some of the policies, I think this question came up a bunch in the chat. I mean, at least from my perspective, and I think it is a widely held one on both sides of the aisle, regardless of what you think reforms should look like entirely, we pretty much all agree that immigration is not working correctly for the United States because we do need more workers. There aren't the systems to allow for, temporary flows of workers, whether you're looking at conservative think tanks or sort of the most liberal, advocacy groups. There's actually a lot of overlap in terms of calls for modernizing the immigration system to actually accommodate, our current numbers of immigration, allowing for like different visa systems, and recognizing the employment draw that is bringing, an unauthorized population here or keeping people here, because it can take years to get those benefits to come. It is really expensive. It often takes a lawyer, even though in theory, one should be able to do it themselves. It's gotten so complex, so lengthy, and so difficult that you're not finding ways to actually make, an immigration system work for families, work for employers, work for universities. And so I think being mindful of that, we've gotten very close to comprehensive immigration reform with, large amounts of support, both from the electorate and from actual, elected officials in Congress at what those changes need to be. And so that's one sort of, one thing to keep in mind, going into the polling places is that this is going to be on the agenda again, regardless of who controls Congress. And so thinking about, what policies are going to support a better set of flows here.
Thank you very much, Kate. Ashley, do you have any response?
I must echo a lot of what Ms. Evans mentioned, that to keep in mind at the election day that no matter what party you stand on, there's actually a lot of things that we agree on. Like she said, making the system more efficient. There is a lack of funding when it comes to the courts, to my agency, and the number of people and how quickly we can process visa applications, how quickly we can move people through the removal proceedings process. And there is a lot of common ground that people do have, and to focus on what those issues are, and that would be the easiest way to move forward long-standing policy as we modernize the immigration policy.
Well, as we say in Turkish, from your lips to God's ears, that there will be a comprehensive immigration reform, hopefully, regardless of who wins. Lee and Ken, what about you?
Lee, I don't know if you want to...
Taking cheap shots at Duke or to consider
I was going to say, you want to go
expensive shots.
Yeah, sure. And I'll let you take that. I mean, you kind of began that conversation about what Duke is doing.
Yeah.
I'll just say one thing. I have been at Duke now for almost 25 years. In 2001, I taught a course called Internet Politics. It was the only thing of its kind here. And there just was not any interest, like students were interested, but there just wasn't a ton of interest among administrators, researchers in technology and politics. That has changed. And Lee on this call is an indicator of that, in addition to all of the other things that are happening at a much higher level, the funding that is available. And I couldn't be more grateful on that side. So let me just say one thing about politics. Politics and elections, they did the same thing. I remember writing a paper that I could not get published in about 2003 that looked at all legislators and everything that they were proposing as far as technology policy was concerned, and no one was talking about it at all. They had no background. They didn't know what they didn't know what they wanted. And then every time something else would happen, a foreign policy related event, a recession, other kinds of issues, they would stop talking about technology. Whereas I think most technology policy people believe that it's one of the things that ties all of these other things together. I've had students do, like studies of media coverage on gun rights. I've had a recent master's student look at the immigration rules that people who are immigrating to the United States have to turn over their login and password for their social media accounts, and how that's working or not working, and what an invasion of privacy that could be. So I think that technology really overlaps with a lot of other things and has implications for a lot of other kinds of decisions. I don't know what to say about the election other than vote your heart, but I would love to see here's my dream, an office that's like the Consumer Protection Bureau, but it helps people for identity theft, because they can't fight the big companies. We need some government help to help little people who have had their money stolen because of fraud and things like that. And it's just not quite there yet. So that's my dream. Lee?
Yeah, and just to elaborate on some of the things we're doing at Duke, I mean, I think picking up on one of the themes that our colleagues on the immigration side said, that when you get into the tech media policies, there's a lot of areas where we agree. Like, for example, the statutes passed by Florida and Texas on the content moderation require transparency. And even you talk to the big tech companies, I mean, nobody is disputing that there needs to be some degree of transparency. People just don't know how to do it. And, there are trade-offs, because if we require too much transparency, we may get more information about source code than anybody can understand. So you're not achieving those goals. If you require too much transparency, you may end up having to give up too much personal data, which undermines privacy goals. Transparency can also undermine the IP rights. So again, what we're trying to do here is come up with solutions that solve problems for everybody and try to build on where we have consensus. Another thing that I'm really excited about of what we're doing on Duke is on the educational front, because the only way we're going to put this country on the right track is to have the next generation of leaders who can solve. And for example, one of the classes I'm teaching started last semester and teaching this semester is an ethical tech practicum, where we bring graduate students together from different schools to work on real world ethical tech problems with real world clients. And that teaches them, it's like, here's the cutting edge problem, here's a client, here's how you develop solutions. And I think by grooming the next generation of Dukies to work collaboratively across disciplines, we're making our contribution in terms of trying to help solve some of these issues.
Wonderful, wonderful. Last but not least, James and Darrell.
In terms of what could Duke do in the gun debate, I think that the Duke Center for Firearms Law is already providing a tremendous service in intellectual leadership, and particularly with the conservative judiciary that often applies this history and tradition test, documenting the fact that there is a history and tradition of gun regulation in the United States seems to have great value for public safety. Do more. I'm going to pitch something live. I think there's huge opportunity, and Lee, you talked about this, a sort of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary convening of people who work on gun safety issues, focused on this Venn diagram that I know, Darrell, your colleagues have, of what's constitutional, what's politically feasible, and what works. There could be tremendous potential. The Trace would be happy to be involved to sort of pull people together virtually or in person, kind of plot a road ahead that actually protects gun owners' rights, and those rights do exist, but also is focused on saving lives. Coming to the election crime, this is a little bit adjacent to our talk today. Crime has become a major issue in the midterms. You will hear claims made that crime rates in cities or states controlled by Democrats with strong gun laws prove that those gun laws don't work. That is cherry picking the data. And in fact, crime has been up in both Democratic and Republican-led states. And the idea that we need a sort of more carceral approach, that criminal justice reforms have been to blame for the crime surge, is not strongly supported by the research, which says that some of these sort of deterrent efforts of long sentencing and mandatory minimums and things like that, there's just not a strong basis for that. And so you're going to see that a lot in the midterms, and there is a way forward, but it doesn't really look like what other party is really talking about. But do not be persuaded that there's proof that gun laws don't work or that criminal justice reforms are to blame.
Right. Darrell?
So I appreciate, James, that shout out. So, I mean, the Duke Center for Firearms Law is, I think, one of the only sort of centers in the country housed at Duke, really dedicated to, getting really good scholarship and information out there about firearms law. And I think Duke has a real critical mass of people that are experts and leading the field. So it's not only Joseph Loker and I and our executive director, Andrew Willinger. It's people like Jeff Swanson, who's over at the medical school, who teaches and researches on issues like suicide prevention and emergency, risk protective orders for people that are a threat to themselves or others. It's people at the Sanford school, like Phil Cook, who's emeritus now, who really sort of pioneered this area, and Kristen Doss. So it's not just a law school; it's really the entire sort of Duke community really trying to get immersed in a really rigorous, scholarly way about these issues, and it's a great credit to Duke and what Duke has been doing.
Wonderful. I would like to just remind everybody Jill Reeves' mandate to us and to the panelists that these are inevitably so brief and so rushed. I hope more of your wisdom and scholarship will be written and shared. And if I can use my moderator privilege, one thing I really hope Duke will do more of or better of is to do the public intellectual work, not only train the future brains of the next generation, which we try to do as good as possible. And part of our training will be to also do a better job in our public intellectual responsibility. Duke is one of the, if not the only top 10 university, it's in a purple state. So I think our responsibility to exemplify and model partisan conversations, understand where the divides are, and play our, I think it's ethical, moral responsibility to educate North Carolina, or broadly speaking, American society. We are trying our very best, but I think that as always, there is a room for improvement. Hopefully we can do more of it. I would like to please join me in thanking all the panelists and all the organizers from the alumni office. I really hope you will find more about Forever Learning Institute at alumni.duke.edu and will be part of the future conversations as well. Thank you very much, and meaningful Yom Kippur to those who celebrate. Looking forward to seeing at least some of you in the future conversations of this Forever Learning. Thank you very much.